I'll just introduce another of our board members, Mac Williams, who, as we talk, one of the things that amazes those of us who get to do barn assessments and see a lot of barns, amazes me especially, is the number of hay trolleys that you see in barns. Almost all these historic barns have hay trolleys. And some of us are way more interested in hay trolleys than others of you, I know, but hopefully you'll all be very interested by the time we get done with this. So we started out with Mac maybe needing to do the presentation himself, but then we lucked out in getting Steve to come. So Mac's actually going to do the introduction, and I'm really looking forward to this. Mac?
So is this removable? No. Okay. Well, I brought along my old number one. This is probably, Steve probably, throws these away because they're so common. But this is a Porter hay trolley, and I discovered it in I think a flea market or an antique store probably 25, 30 years ago. And I'm going to put it down because it's heavy.
Here, do a few.
But, yeah. Seeing it for the first time, it's like, what is that? And it's like, oh, I think I've seen those before. They're in the top of barns. And that was kind of like my first introduction to the hay trolley. And it's like, I got to figure out how this thing works and learn more about it. And so I'm sure, when you learn about the people who collect these, it's like, okay, it's an addiction. It's a fascination, and in looking at the ones that Steve has brought, it's like, it's such a classic form and function thing. It's like, they're beautiful. And it just kind of reminds you of, I'm done. The evolvement of America and how people who innovated and invented and made themselves a lot of money by being the smartest people that invented things that helped farmers do their thing and made labor so much easier. And the thing about the hay trolley is barns are bigger because they made it easier to put a whole bunch of hay in a barn, and you could have more livestock because you could store hay much easier. And the thing is, so Kent mentioned doing barn assessments. So one of the first things I do when I walk into a barn is, at first I look down so I don't have the problem that stepping in something. And then I look up because I'm looking for the track and the hay trolley. And sometimes they're way up there in the dark nether regions of the barn. And it's, you take your phone out, you try to zoom in and see if you can tell what's up there and what it is. But it's a fascinating thing, and it's just a part of barn history and rural farm history that I find fascinating. And so without further ado, so happy to have Steve Weber here, one of the star collectors of this technology and a lot of farm stuff. He lives on a 5th-generation farm in Iowa City, Iowa. He's one of the co-founders, if you will, of a group of collectors called HayTrolleyHeaven.com. You got to check it out. Amazing amount of resources about hay trolleys, but just history in general of the rural heritage that created all this. And he has such a curated collection that he's like, well, I'm coming to Indiana. I'll bring ones that were made in Indiana. There were probably 100 manufacturers of these things at any, through its history. They ended up being consolidated into a lot of bigger companies. But he has some really rare hay trolleys. And before I have him come up, I also want to implore you to use technology, go on the internet. There are some YouTube videos featuring Steve. They are fascinating. And he tells the story of the Loudon Company, William Loudon, who is from Fairfield, Iowa, just not too far away from Iowa City. He's like the inventor of the hay trolley, or certainly one of the innovators of it. And the stories that he's like a professional historian in my mind, because none of it was scripted. It was all Q&A, and his knowledge of the history of Loudon and hay trolleys in general is just, it's amazing. So without further ado, please welcome Steve Weber. This is a picture of his museum.
Well, I grew up on a farm, and first job interview I had, the guy says here you were a farmer in high school. What's that mean? I said, well, farming, plowing the ground, tilling, planting crops, cultivating, harvesting, milking the cows, eating beef, cattle, messing with sheep, chickens. Oh, he says, you were a farmer. I said, yes. I said, my grades were not very good. I assure you of that, because I was a wrestler, and I had my sport, and a farmer. As a wrestler, I was a strong kid, at my age, I was pretty good at it. And ladies, I like girls and all that good stuff. So I was busy doing things other than that. I wasn't too scholarly, but they finally let me into college. And I remember in high school, everybody has boys and girls advisors in those days. This guy said, Weber, we recommend 95% of students from Iowa State High School go on to the University of Iowa. But he said, I would not suggest that in your case. So that sort of got under my skin a little bit, And later in life, he would have rolled over in his grave to find out that I had straight A's the senior year of college, and as the chairman of the college I went to for 4 years, he would flip his wig over it. But anyway, that's me in a nutshell. Now we're going to talk about hay trolley heaven. We are a very different group, and Matt touched on it. We are organically grown. We're a little bit nuts, as he said, and we have a meet once a year, 3-day meet, and the host says it's on Friday and Saturday, but people start showing up on Thursday. This is like relatives that show up early for a family reunion. So at any rate, so here we go, but that's the way they are, because they buy, sell, and trade things. People show up,
this one.
pickup load after pickup load of hay trolleys, and they buy, sell, trade, and just have a good time. So another thing about our group, you wonder sometimes why we don't have a board, we don't have any formal thing going on, we don't have any fundraising, we don't have a treasury, we don't have any of those things. Because a second meeting we had at my place, I said, we're gonna get organized here. And so I said, Fortune 500, I said, I know this. We got all organized with these little bit objectives, transparency, and the exercise is gonna be, let's get together and query the group. There's about 30 people, it's about this size. And we're gonna look at these trolleys and decide out which ones are common, which ones are fine, which ones are rare. I got the hay trolley number about 12 or 13. Somebody opened the back door and said, hey, Rudy's here. He's got a trailer full of trolleys for sale. Those people got out. I didn't think he could get out of the room that fast. And I was lucky I was in the front of the room, at the back of the room, and they'd run over me, So I'm sitting there and I said, I think I got a memo here, They want to get together and have fun, but they don't want, we tried to have some organized thing, the same thing, everybody fell asleep and whatever, but, so we're a little nutty that way. Hay Trolley Heaven, the name, we started out with, we're gonna be the American Hay Tool Collective. And Barry was the Marinoff was our guy, and he did a lot of graphic arts for the factory. So he was an engineer, and this is what I was going to here's. And I'm going to trip over that. So okay. Yeah, I'm going to get it on crack. I didn't want to do that. Look at work. Can you still hear me? Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, know. Anyway, so where was I? Explaining the history of our name. So we started out, Mary's gonna call it American Hate Club. I said, well, there's a problem there. And Mary said, what's that? The Canadians. We have a lot of Canadian friends, about 10% of them. They might get irritated if we call it American Hate Club. But let's call it the North American. Mary, oh, okay, we'll call it North American. And then later, we did a website, a .com website, and that's a story in itself, which I'm not sure. So one of the guys, the way the website came about, a guy called me up and said, hey, he's from Nebraska. He said, we got this new guy up in Maine, and he's sort of a pain in the neck. When you call this guy, he said, he's been bugging me, wanting to take all the parts, and wants this pulley, and wants that gizmo, and he wants that clevis, he wants all this stuff. And I don't have time to mess with this hour after day going, I'm retired. Doug's just started his career out. So I did all this, I talked to him by telephone, get to know him, his name's Dan, that's, I'm sure his artwork that was up there half on. And Dan says, I need all this stuff. And I said, well, Dan, I'm not running a hardware store for hay trolley parts. However, you know, if you need help, I'll find a way to help you out. So sure enough, I had everything he wanted. I sent him an email and I showed him the pictures of the stuff that I was going to send him. And he sent me back the longest text I received in my entire life. It had to be that long, you know. And it started out with an English brogue. I am exceedingly grateful for your generous offer to sell me this stuff for $200 and dot, 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 dot. And I'm reading this thing, and down at the very bottom it says, and in exchange for all of this, I'm going to send you $1,000 check to your favorite charity. So I read that, and the first thing I said, who is this guy? You know, us Midwest guys don't do business that way. You know, this guy is something else, this Maine guy. So we got to know one another, and he was a real brainy guy. And I did some research, and I found out he was a billionaire. I'd never met a billionaire in my life, but Dan was, and he had all these ideas about a website. So we're going to do a website. So okay, I think that's a good idea. So we started working on the website, and I had hired a young lady from, she had moved back from California, her and her husband. They were out there. She's a web designer. They were starting to have a family, and they wanted to move back to the Midwest. Familiar story to everybody, I think, in the room that has relatives. And so here's Dan on the iPhone and Laura in Iowa City, and so we get all the way down, and he starts in trying to sell us on the idea of doing a website. And I said, Dan, yes, we're all in agreement. We're going to do a website. So let's spend our time talking about the website. Now, remember, I'm a Iowa farm guy, and he's a sophisticate from the East Coast. And, oh, okay, we can move right forward. Yes, we can. So anyhow, we got into it. And what really created the website wasn't me or Dan, either one. It was a snowstorm in the Northeast. And he sent me a picture when we were working of the window in his house. He said, look at this. Here's a window and it had snow halfway up. He said, now what's impressive, that's the second floor of the house, not the first floor. So I had this guy hostage for almost 2 months. We were on the phone all the time going back and forth. And he wanted to use GoDaddy. And I said, Laura said, well, we don't want to use GoDaddy. Why? He says, well, you're building a giant database. And if you use GoDaddy, they change the software every 2 years. You're going to have to reload it. Dan says, oh, okay, fine. So at any rate, we got to know one. But that winter, we put together an information thing, which was very instrumental in our history going forward. And we have a web, several of us that work on that. That's our research center, a data center. So if you want to know what trolley Mac held up, you go to heytrolleyheaven.com and you go in and you hit Porter. That's a Porter. There's a slider ball. Whoops, there it is. And you click on that, and there's a patent data and the whole thing, just as Mac was describing. That's how the website got done. And then a young guy came along later. We're about 6 years older than your group. A guy came along later, and he had a Facebook page called Cajun Hay Trolley. Now, you know, I don't know how many have been down to Louisiana, but they don't put up a lot of hay down there. So, you know, Cajun Hay Trolley wasn't exactly something to blow your socks off. He called me up and he said, say, can we use the name Hay Trolley Heaven on a Facebook page? I said, sure. about that semi. His name's Clint Flack. And Clint was a brainy young guy from Pennsylvania. And he's it's sort of a stay-at-home dad without children, with that sort of unemployed, his wife's school teacher. But he really loved this stuff. And so he did a tremendous amount of good. And I was talking to our round barn buddy over here, and he was talking about constant posting of things create a lot of interest in whatever you're doing. And so he would put out all sorts of stuff. But the only thing you found out about Clint, it was like if you told him, the whole world knew about it, whether you wanted the world to know about it or not, the whole world knew about it. And he helped us a lot. And we're approaching 10,000 members on our Facebook page, which is good. And we don't care about the numbers, but the research center gets 2,000 visits a month, and half of them are from new people, and half of them are from people that have used the website before. But Lisa is our webmaster. She's a Buckeye, grain elevator, commodity trading gal. Lives home on the farm with her dad, brainy gal. She runs our Facebook page, and she keeps the statistics. And the thing that we're most proud of at Hay Trolley Heaven is we have as many 20-year-old members as we have 30-year-old members, as we have 40-year-old members, as 50-year-old members, 60-year-old members, and all of us guys. Jim is wave your hand. He's a grandfather of the group. He's 2 months older than I am. At any rate, us old guys, we're like 5% of the group, and we're sort of proud of that. We really are. So that's Hay Trolley Heaven and sort of who we are. Now I'm going to move on, if I don't break my neck here, and talk about, so I decided to bring these Indiana hay trolleys down here. And my first connection to Indiana, grew up on the farm. We got a TV set somewhere in the 50s. And there was a guy who I don't think, some of you may not never heard of this guy. His name was Herb Schreiner. And Herb Schreiner was from Indiana, one of the early TV guys. And he would come out like this, and he'd either sit on a stool or put his foot up on a chair, and he'd start talking. And you never knew where the bus was going. You got on the bus with him, you didn't know where this guy was going, but it was entertaining as all get out. And he died at 51. He reminded me of George Burns. They were the same age. And George Burns, a lot more people know because he was older. But George Burns was another guy that had come out and sat on a stool. He had a cigar and he just talked. So when Christine said, "Where's your PowerPoint presentation?" I said, "I don't do that. I do the Herb Schreiner, George Burns deal. I just go sit up here and talk." So at any rate, that was my first introduction to Indiana. And believe me, in those days when you grew up and TV was new and everything, Indiana was foreign, Nebraska was foreign, the whole Big Ten thing was foreign to us, they show, oh, there's a guy from Nebraska, never seen one of those, And any rate, that's the world I grew up in. So I decided to bring these trolleys from Indiana, and if you're still with me. So if you look at them, and some of them you see, and some of you don't, this is the oldest hay trolley in Indiana, and it's 1870, Violet's patent, Goshen, Indiana, manufactured by Krebs. I knew about the patent of this. So this thing shows up at Chupp's auction house. How many have been to Chupp's auction house? Well, a few of you. Well, I had the pleasure and pain of bidding on this little beauty here, and $15,000 later, it went in my car, and home she went, But at any rate, I knew about this, but I didn't know anything about the research. So a number of us were involved, but we went over to the Elkhart County Historical Society, and there's a young archivist there, and she is really good. And I said, I want to learn about John A. Violet. He's the guy that did this. And so she had lined all these books up, and I learned a lot about him. He's a homesteader. His dad stopped in Fort Wayne, Indiana, got on a horse, was headed for Iowa, but he passed Goshen. He stopped. He liked it there. The land was good. There was timber there. There was a stream running through town, and his dad envisioned a lot of things, so he homesteaded 350 acres. And his son, John, decided at age 20 or 21, the gold rush was on, 1850,
So he says, Dad, I'm going west. And so he goes across land all the way to Mormon Island out there, digs for gold. A year later, he's ready to come home, and he'd gone overland. And so he said, I'm going to take a ship. I'm going to come out of San Francisco Bay and go right down to the isthmus, and you'd walk across in those days and catch a boat up the Mississippi River and come back home. Well, one thing happened on the trip. They got down, it was a sail ship, and he got down near the isthmus, the Panama, and a wind came out of the east and blew him all the way to Tahiti, if you can believe that. That's a long way if you know your geography. So here's old John on that boat, and he looked around, and the first thing he thought of was, Dad's got a lot of barns on the farm. He's got a chicken house, hog house, dairy barn, cattle barn, machine barn, shop here, shop there. He's got everything. Hell's bells. We ought to do it like this boat. We ought to have everything in one barn. So his idea, and he saw all these block and tackle things on the ship, putting sails up and down and cargo on and off and everything else. He said, I'm going to build one big barn. Well, the one big barn required a way of moving stuff around. So he built a barn there, and it was, I think I walked the footprint of it. It was like 250 foot long and 75 wide. It was a big barn. And he built the barn, and the idea was everything was going to be in the one barn. But he needed a hoist, so he came up with this hoist. And it's very unique. It runs on 2.5 by 3.25 track. Nobody did this. These are wood runners here on the side. I did them out of wood, but the real one's out of metal. This is concaved. It has a bump plate on the bottom. It has rollers that are very similar to the Loudon ones from Iowa. And this guy, Violet, and Bill Loudon from Iowa, and a guy by the name of Ricker in New York, and a guy by the name of Myers, not F.E. Myers, Myers Housel in Canton, Ohio, were the first 4 guys to invent hay trolleys. So this thing was born out of that. We found not only the information on John Violet, the biggest cemetery in Goshen, Indiana is the Violet Cemetery. It's about about a square mile. And John buried his dad over there, and he's buried there. And the interesting story is his tombstone is a rock. It's about this big. And it says John A. Violet, born, died, and that's it. And then you start looking at the relatives around him. Whoa, boy, those tombstones kept getting bigger and fancier and bigger and fancier. You can do a whole circle of them, You can see where the money went, and then eventually you get back down to normal folks, And, but the Violet, and there was the first hotel in Goshen, Indiana was a Violet Hotel. They built that. They were very charitable people and did a lot of give back to the district. He didn't sell many of these. They were too big, too expensive, too fancy, too everything. And this Krebs guy, he was selling grain registers, if you know what a grain register is. But at any rate, the first thrashing machines on the farm were communal. So everybody brought their bundles over and ran them through the machine, and they had to find out, whose was Charlie's and whose was Harry's and who was Joe's. And he built them, and grain registers require foundry capability, a lot of machining and everything else. So Crepes manufactured these. Shockingly, we actually found in his personal papers. So John, he came back, and the first thing he did was build a mansion there in Goshen. And if you have a chance, I don't even know who owns it now, but the Historical Society does. It was a palatial place, the house. It's still there. And in the house were the papers, and that's where I found all the information on. And believe it or not, there was a flyer, an 1871 flyer showing this hay trolley. And the archivist and I both about flipped when we saw that. We just couldn't believe that. She was in another room, and I came with her and said, "Hey, we hit the mother lode." She said, "What do you mean?" She walked in and she said, "I can't believe it." I promised to bring this back to her someday. So Violet was one of the early guys that came up with the whole idea of a hay trolley. And that's why. And in the plot book, it's interesting. You can see his dad's farm with all these outbuildings. You can see his farm with the big house and the one barn. And I don't know what happened to the first one. I think it burned down. The second one was built on the same footprint in 1915, about the age of this barn. And it was all outfitted with Loudon equipment, because Loudon was much more in the commercial end of it. So that's Indiana's first hay trolley. Then there was a guy in town by the name of Herbert, says here, Herbert Myers and Company, Warsaw, Indiana. But he was an inventive guy, and he was from Goshen, and he was pretty good at inventing things, but he wasn't very good at selling stuff and marketing stuff and making money. So he sold the rights to
This trolley to Goshen Manufacturing Company. And Goshen Manufacturing Company was run by A.P. Boyer.
He was a Michigan State grad. He lived just outside in Michigan, about 20 miles from the border, and he came across and set up shop in Goshen because there was a foundry there with malleable iron. And A.P. Boyer got the patent rights from this guy, enhanced them, and went from this big clunky thing to things that were much more commercially saleable. And I was telling the guys at our table, somebody wonders how rare Goshen hay trolleys are. And about when I was new at this 20 years ago, I got in contact with a guy from Gas City, Indiana, and he said, "Say, I got a bunch of hay trolleys and I want to sell them to one guy." And of course, I was a top candidate of the one guy, so I get my trailer and I go down to his place, and this guy had hay trolleys everywhere. He had them in the garage, he had them in the chicken house, he had them in the barn, he had them in the basement of the house. He had, and this is an all-day project, just dragging these trolleys out. And I said, "All right, pal, how are we going to come up to the money side of this?" He said, "Well," I said, "how about this? We'll make a $25 pile, a $50 pile, a $75 pile, $100 pile, and up. And we'll put them into 4 piles and we'll go from there." So we're dragging these out all day. And this $75 pile just kept growing and growing. I kept looking at growing and growing. They're all Goshen, from Goshen, Indiana. And I said, as we were having lunch, I said, those things are not that rare. They need to go over here in this $50 pile because I drug those things back to Iowa. And of course, nobody in Iowa had seen them, but I had a hard time getting rid of them. And I finally took a dozen of them and gave them to a guy in New York for a hay fork. He had a rare hay fork that he had, and he took them back, and they sold pretty good in New York because nobody had seen a Goshen, so he got rid of them. At any rate, that tells you a little bit about that. So the two big epicenters in Indiana were Goshen in the later days, because Boyer came around about the turn of the century and commercialized the blue one over there, and it really took off. So down here in River City, this little guy says Lafayette, Indiana. That gets your attention, and he was the original inventor. The year goes back to '83, and for those of you that haven't seen, it's called the Hoosier Sliders. So you sort of, even if you're Iowa, you know where that's from. That came from Indiana in 1873. So he was early, a very early guy. And then also these are marked in at least 6 or 7 different ones. We have one just like this, says Dubuque, Iowa. It's got a wider wood roller in it. I don't know what that was all about. It says Faulkner on it. And Faulkner was a guy that made on a baby carriage, how the hoops go up and down on buggies. That was Faulkner. He was the inventor of that. And he traveled all over, and he ran into this guy down here in Indiana. And that's how he got hooked up with him and started selling them in Iowa. But these things are rare. My other favorite Hoosier Slider story, Portland, Indiana. I'm sure a lot of you go to the Portland show or have been to the Portland show. And George was one of our older guys. And George says, "Say, I know a guy that has one of those Hoosier Sliders." "Yeah?" He said, "Yeah, he claims it in his 2-car garage." "Yeah?" "And it's covered up with stuff. And I've been after him for years and couldn't find it." So I said, and George was always trying this or that or something else. So I wrote the guy a letter. And I said, "If you can find that Hoosier Slider, I'll give you $1,000 for it." George would never have thought of that. So at any rate, I'm at Portland. I'm walking down the row of stuff. And this guy, he came like he was shot out of a cannon. Where did he come from? He said, "Do you remember me?" I said, "Yes, I do." He said, "You sent me a letter. Do you remember that?" "Yes, I do." He said, "Do you remember what you said?" I said, "Yes, I do." So at any rate, he goes around the truck and he's carrying this Hoosier slider and it's all screwed up. Somebody took it apart and put it together backwards or something. So I give him the $1,000. He's there. There's a bunch of these pickers around. They said, "Hey, anybody got a adjustable wrench?" So I'm sitting there, and all these guys are like they're looking at a dead duck. They're like, what is that thing, you know?" And so I'm taking the thing apart and putting it back together. And I said, "It's a Hoosier slider." "It's a what?" "It's a Hoosier slider from here in Indiana." "Yes." "Where are you from?" "Iowa." "How do you know that?" I said, "Well, it says, I just know it's a Hoosier slider." So we put the thing back together. But us people are funny, and our only the hate trolley guys, hate trolley heaven. Everybody else says, "What's your mission statements?" "To have fun." We have a lot of it, more than we should. So Jim and we decided Jim was going to do a round barn tour of New York. And I said, "Okay, how long is that going to take?" "Well, you come on up and you're going to stay overnight at my place. And the next day we're going to go the Canadian route over to New York and we're going to visit 14 barns." And so we were looking around, and I'm mixing them trips up because Vermont's where we got the round barn thing from the lawyer. At any rate, it was a Vermont trip. And we went through Vermont. And Jim is very good at this because he just walks up and says, "I'm Jim Gray. I'm from Detroit. I collect hay trolleys. I like round barn hay trolleys. And if you got one, I want it and I'll pay for it." Well, that's pretty clear. It's the first thing they do. "We'll go see if we have one." So they go and look at these guys. "You want that thing up there?" And he says, "Yeah, you gotta," he said, "but we're working for this lawyer and we're going to have to call him up, And as soon as he says that, he said, "Ooh, this could take a while. And so at any rate, Jim says, "Yep, it's way up there. Yep, that's what we want." And he said, "Well, we got to call the boss." And Jim said, "Well, you tell the boss that we're only going to be in the neighborhood for an hour and we're driving down the road. If you want to sell that thing, you better get off at dead center." So I'm out photographing something. It was a beautiful time of year. The leaves were out and we're just having a great time. And Jim yells out the window, "Hey, it's the lawyer, yeah? He wants to sell the trolley. He wants $300 for it. What are we doing?" "We're buying." "That's what we're doing. We're buying." "Okay." So we go back. And these two guys were funny. They were in their 40s. And Jim was a lot older than they were. They were afraid to go up the ladder. So Jim goes up the ladder, and we get the thing down. And they get it. These two young guys get it down there. The lawyer got skinned on this deal because he paid them a lot more than $100. We took 2 hours to get that thing down. These guys looked over and said, "That is what you're after?" We said, "Yes, that's what we're after." He said, "But it's missing 2 wheels." And Jim said, "You see this guy here? He's got a 5-gallon bucket full of those wheels. Don't worry about it." So, and then the other one I remember was we were in New York and he had organized that trip and we did 14 barns. And we got out of the last barn we went to, and I didn't know how thorough he was at doing this. And we get out of the truck, Jim and I were walking. These kids come running out, "Grandpa, Grandpa, Grandpa." I said, "Well, they got us pegged all right." And the kids, and there's a young couple there, and they had 1 horse, 1 cow, one chicken, 1 this, 1 that, 1 everything. And he says, "So what are you after?" When Jim does the drill, "Hay trolley." "Well, I don't know if we got one or not." So he goes in, we looked up, no hay trolley, which most of them don't have a round barn hay trolley in. And the guy says, "How many barns do you visit in New York?" He said, "This number 14. And the kid said, "Well, that's all there are." Jim says, "How do you know that?" He said, "Before we bought this place, we checked it out. We went and visited all around barns in New York, and there's 14 of them." I said, "Well, he knows what he's doing. He was a logistics guy for Corian in Detroit. He knows his stuff." So at any rate, we just have a lot of fun in our group, finding these things, celebrating them, and let's talk just a bit. So when I started out, there were about 4 of us that built museums for hay trolleys, and are major. I'd say we're in the 300 range, 400 range. But we're now where we're about 4 a year being built around the country, hay trolley museums. We just had our show down at Carl Wagner's in Missouri. He just finished his. Dave Wilson in Des Moines. Doc and I are supposed to go next week or the week after. I don't know if we're going to make it or not. He's building his. Margaret's been working on hers. She's one of our Indiana uh, players. And we got a guy in Kansas. He's going to collapse the roof. He started from scratch. And about a year ago, no, 18, we come to a show. He's a great big man. He says, I want to talk to you. I said, well, can I unload my stuff and then we'll talk? So he plants himself in front of me and he says, I've been watching these videos. He said, and I really like hay trolleys. He said, I'm up to 75 already. And he said, next time I saw him, he says, I'm up to 200 already. He does 3 a week and posts them on Hay Trolley Heaven. You know, he polishes them all up and hangs them up and everything else. And so the garage is full and his wife's a smoker and she has a little veranda and he's eyeing this 12 by 12 veranda, you know, saying, honey, can we hang him up there? She said, no, no, you can't hang him up. So at any rate, we're a little bit crazy. So now I'll stop talking about what I want to talk about. And no question is crazy, but what would you like to know about hay trolleys? You got to be like the 10-year-old kids I had from one of the middle schools came out, and a teacher said, she asked me, we want you to come to town and give a lecture on levers and pulleys. And I said, I don't want to do that. I said, why don't you bring the kids out to farm? I got a whole building full of them. These 10-year-old came in and it was art Linkletter all over again. You know, the teachers were in the corner. These kids started asking questions. The teacher, oh my, you know, how'd you do this? What did this place cost? Where did you get all these things? You know, they're 10-year-old kids. They're just great. So pretend you're a 10-year-old and what do you want to know about hay trolleys? Who's going to be first? Yes, Mac.
Can you talk a little bit about how marketing made such a big difference with all these manufacturers?
Yeah. So earlier, somebody asked me. So there are about 350 inventors going back, and the inventive period was from the Civil War on up to about 1910. That's when a lot of these were invented. Out of that, by the time railroads came in around 1900, 8 companies were probably doing 80% of the business. And they were the ones that had railroad access and so forth. In the early days, this early Goshen by me, Violet and Loudon were early guys. They would have a little shop somewhere and some farmer would come in and it'd say, Hay Tool Works or something. They'd say, I want a hay trolley. And literally he'd say, well, how about next Wednesday? And he'd put one on his buggy and he'd drive over to the farmer's barn and he'd deliver the trolley. And he'd tell him what he was going to need to set up for track and a lot of the early ones in the early days had counterweights on them. So it was very personally done by the inventor. Then Loudon and Myers out of Ashland were the 2 big ones. They started making catalogs. And there's a story behind each company in the catalog. They started making catalogs. And then the way those companies went was through hardware stores because it was local. And you needed somebody to explain to the farmer how to buy them, how to install them in the barn, what kind of pulleys they were going to use. They sold them hay forks and everything else. So it sort of went pretty much down the road of hardware stores where the distribution all the way up until the railroads got fully integrated into our country around 1900. And then there were a couple guys up in Wisconsin that didn't have the railroad access that came up with the idea of mail order. So everybody's seen a Sears, Roebuck, and Montgomery Ward catalog. So a lot of the manufacturers beat a path to those 2 outfits wanting to sell their trolleys because they could envision, you know, it's like selling cameras to Chinese. There's a lot of them over there, you know. We just figure out how to sell them a toothbrush or a camera, we'll be rich. So that was Montgomery Ward and Sears. Everybody wanted to sell stuff over there. So half the market sort of went that way, and the other mail order guys went the mail order way. And the mail order guys, in the catalogs, there was a complete description, an engineering drawing, a description of the trolley, how to install it in the barn, how to But when you get to the Sears and Montgomery Wards, the conversation was crisp, the description was crisp, the stuff was cheap, it was made lightweight. It was mailed to you, and you bought it, you own it, and if it busted in a year, you buy another one. You know, where have we heard that before? The Walmarting of the day. But that's the way they were marketed. And the last one to end the story, the last one was we're in the Sears catalog, and Munger, they stopped selling about 1953. That there was no sharp line that was the end of it. But when Sears and Ward's stopped putting them in their catalogs, you know the heydays were over of putting up hay that way. So that's a little quick run through of how they were sold and marketed. Yes.
Can you just describe a little bit on how they were used, the process? Like,
Yeah.
I have a lot of arms and I have a lot of babies, and I don't really know anything about them.
Yeah. Okay. The question is, how did these things work, and how were they invented? And I'll do that real crisply. So the farmers that came from Europe did everything by hand. They would they would use sickles to cut the stuff. They'd use rakes, large wooden rakes to rake it up. Then they'd use a pitchfork, put it on a wagon. Then they'd go to the barn. It was all put up with a fork about that long. They're done physically. So America, which is the greatest place on the face of the earth, people said there's got to be a better way to do this. This is getting ridiculous. They invented a horse-drawn mower, so they didn't have to do that anymore. Then the problem was raking the hay, because you could do all this stuff in 2 days with a horse, but who's going to rake the hay? So then there was about 20-year lapse in raking the hay. Then they got hay loaders, and they're still. So now it's on the wagon. How do you get it up? How do you get it up in the hay mow? So all these block and tackle systems had one thing in common. They would pick a load up with a hay fork. They would raise it up to the barn. There's a little trolley in most barns. It engages in the trolley, and it goes click, and then the weight is transferred from the rope to the trolley, and there's slack in the rope, and then you'd pull the rope back in. And there's somebody in the hay mow, and there's somebody down below operating the hay fork, or sticking the fork, as we called in our day. And you'd trip the rope, and it'd drop the bales or loose hay. And then you pulled the trolley out with the trip rope, and it come to the front of the barn, and it hit a thing we call in the trade a knocker, or a stop. And that did two things: stop the trolley, release the pulley, the traveling pulley and fork, and it went down for another load. And some of the early ones, one of the earliest ones out east, was first patented as a device to retrieve well water. You do the same thing. You send an empty bucket down, you fill it with water, you pull it up. You got to pull it over and dump it somewhere and bring it back, empty thing down, go down. But the Bill Loudon was one of the early inventors, and he had a lot of physical disabilities and arthritis as a teenager, so he couldn't do any work. So he sat there and watched his relatives do all this stuff, and he said, there's got to be a better way to do this. So he was one of the early inventors of, we're going to use horses and block and tackle and find a way to get this off the back of farmers so it would go up, over, and down. So
That's interesting, because my great grandfather was also disabled because he fell out of a barn when he was little, and so that may be why we have so many of them.
yeah. Oh, exactly. This Loudon guy was something else. And to extend the story a little bit, so he came up with the idea, and a lot of these inventors had ideas, but then they faded. But he had a brother down in Kansas City that was a lawyer, and he was a real estate guy, so he knew how to do business. And he came back, and the two of them really worked well together, because he knew how to do catalogs, he knew about sales and marketing, and Bill did all the inventing and so forth. And I don't think management was his, but the company just took off. They were very, very successful, and as was Myers, and there's 8 or 9 other companies. But somebody in the group had to, in addition to being an inventor, had to have the mindset and knowledge about how to get these things out, how to get them sold and marketed and so forth. So that brother duo, brothers don't always get along, as we all know, but that set of brothers got along just great. And it's funny because I just worked on the Loudon, on the the lawyer's house down there. A young couple bought it and they're rehabbing it and so forth. So this is typical. So the inventor lived in a little frame house right across from the factory and walked to work every day. His brother, who was also, he lived downtown, and he had a big fancy house, and there's a tunnel in the house, so he could go from the breakfast table through the tunnel to a heated carriage house that had his horses and heated carriage in it, and he'd get in his carriage, and he'd go over to work and get dropped off, and the guy'd go back home. I can just see in the wintertime, this guy was living the dream, and his brothers walking to town. But the two of them made a really, really good pair to develop the business and make it work. So, but there you go. Yes, question.
I'm from the Crawfordsville area, I wondered if you had any more history of that.
Yeah, Crawfordsville is one of my weakest, but the Hoosier Sliders started there, and they sold a lot of those locally, and I don't know very much about that because I haven't had time to do research. I couldn't find hardly anything on the internet. The Browers, which was also from Crawfordsville, the Browers is 1883, so it came along later, and they were much more successful. You find a lot more Browers, but even Browers, what on earth are they selling for these days? Browers, $1,500, $2,000, something like that. Huh?
The pulleys at least five.
Yeah, just the pulley, the little pulley that goes with it. I always tell people, you're not going to find one of these at the hardware store. A crazy looking thing, but they had a lot of success, and they were from Crawfordsville, and they're called Browers. They sold a lot more of those. I know very little really about it because I haven't had the time to look. But somewhere down there, if somebody does some digging around, I'm sure you'll find something on them. And it's an area that I wish we knew a lot more about them. Obviously, we have all the patent stuff on the Hoosier Slider and the Browers from Crawfordsville. So we know the patent stuff. We've not seen a catalog. I don't think we've seen a catalog on either one of them. Maybe on the Hoosier Slider.
Yes,
But we have it on the Hoosier, but not on the Browers. So we're missing a lot of stuff. And so anybody that wants to poke their head in on it, do. Anything? Yes, sir.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about what brought about the demise of the hay trolleys?
Okay, the question is, what sort of ended the hay trolley era? And sure as hell, there's another guy from Iowa, Vermeer. He invented the round bale. And what happened to most of the hay lofts, except in the Amish community, is they started producing these bales that weighed 1,000 pounds, or 500 pounds, or 1,200 pounds, depending on the moisture content of them. And these things got principally stacked outside or in makeshift hoop barns where you take a forklift. And my neighbors are dairy farmers. They finally, the two of them quit, but Viola, she was a little gal. I don't think she weighed 80 pounds. And her job was to haul the bales from the field. The boys would load them up, and she was on a truck, and she'd come down that gravel road. Oh, you'd see his dust flying, and you couldn't see anybody in there because Violet she was driving the truck, And you knew when she went around the corner too fast because a couple of round bales in the ditch, and she didn't let any grass grow under her feet. And she milked all the cows. And her husband was a very wise guy. He had rubber mats in there where the cows came in, and he had everything automated way before anybody else. But Violet would go in there and milk sun up and sun down, milk cows. But yeah, basically it was the introduction of round bales that caused the demise of that. And I have run into a couple Canadians that actually put them up in the haymow and unroll them and then use them that way. But no one else hardly that I know. So hence the end of the haymows. And then, as you guys know from being in the barn business, as the farm equipment, especially tractors, got bigger and bigger, they couldn't put them in there anymore. And then people are looking at, well, what are we going to do? Well, we're not going to spend any money on that because it's not a very usable space. And it caused a lot of the barns to disappear. But it was really the introduction of the round barn. And then the other thing that happened is when the farmer got to the end of where the hemp rope would bust, he said, "Are we going to do this?" So he said, "I'm tired of messing with that thing. Let's cut a hole inside the barn, put the grain elevator up there, and we're going to send them up in the grain elevator, and we're not going to mess with that trolley anymore because I don't know what the rope cost, but it was cheaper to cut a hole in the barn and shove the elevator than it was to go buy new rope." So I think those are probably the two biggest factors that brought an end to them. But fortunately, our history still resides in a lot of these barns that haven't gone down. Somebody asked, I said, well, our guys in particular like barns that have already gone down. I said, they go over and sawzall, cut holes in the roof, they'll crawl underneath there and they'll thief out that piece of history and save it. So there's a lot of that goes on. Another question.
How many, it seems to me the oldest ones that at least I've
Yeah.
seen are wooden,
Yes.
have a wooden rail.
Yeah.
Did everybody start with a wooden rail, or did like Loudon and some start with metal?
That's a very good question. Question is, the early ones were wood. I've got a wall about this big, and it's got 35 wooden hay trolleys on it. And the age group of the wooden ones would surprise you, because Loudon's early ones were wood sliders, and then there's a few East Coast producers, Arnold and some others that made wood sliders, but some of them are, I call it, they never got the memo down there. I mean, somebody invented one in 1883, and by then we had all this kind of stuff going on. And you said, well, that's interesting. And the one I got was, what the heck was that guy's name? At any rate, he was down in Viola, Tennessee. I remember that. And I can't remember the name of the trolley, but it came on and the crowd went wild. It was a wood one from down there, and I think it had an 1890 patent date on it or something. It had a big gear on it, and came up and hit a kick plate, and that released the gear so that it run. It was crazy, and I thought, well, I'll do the history on that. So I dug around, and I found a gal by the name of Violet, whatever the name of the hay trolley is. So I said, well, she must be a relative. The town 800 people. I'm going to look her up. So I did. I tried to look her up and found out she was in prison for shooting a 75-year-old. I said, I better stay away from that. We'll leave that dead dog lie. But so it's a good question. And see, the thing that drove the industry technically was malleable iron. The early ones were made out of gray iron that's used for engine blocks and stuff like that, but it doesn't have any flex. And the malleable iron companies were not that many around. So when you got away from that and got rural, there were still people. And I got some beautiful Indiana ones. I never even thought to bring those. I mean, they're huge, And some guy right down there in Huntington or that area down there, he was making them out of wood. And so there's another guy didn't get the memo, because by then there was a lot of stuff being made out of cast iron. So they span quite an age group. There's only 2 or 3 of us that are into that. It's a joy of my life, those, because they're just a great piece of wood. So I get them, and my job is to find out who made this thing, what the patent date was, what the town was. And like our friend Rick Plant brought one that he had bought in an antique store for $40 and he didn't know what it was. And finally, I found the patent date on it, and it's a crazy funky thing because it's square, had rollers on top. So the early ones with rollers on top couldn't go into the barn more than 20 or 30 feet as long as you could cut a plank, because there was no way for hangers except on one end and the other end. And it fell out of one of my file folders. I said, there it is. That's what he's looking for. He's been offered like 3,000 or 4,000 for it now that he knows what it is. And I made a replica of it and put the town in Maslin, Ohio, if I recall right. I can't remember the name of the trolley. So all those wood guys come to me, and I'm working on 3 of them right now because I'm the old man in the group, and I have the patience and the passion to figure out where this thing came from. And then we make copies of them. Jim and I are doing what, 2 or 3 of them now from the last show all showed up and we're working on them. But we're always excited to find out who actually made this thing. And believe me, there were people that laid in bed at night thinking some of these things up. Some of them are dang complicated. You take the wood, the springs pop out at you and everything else, stuff they picked up from the farm, you know, to make stuff out of. But it's so the wood ones are fascinating, but they span quite a period of time and they go from elegantly simple to horribly complicated. And I'm working on one right now. My wood guy, we dug it out. We sort of know what it is. And he turned to me, and Doc Gill's my sidekick here. He's a dentist. He said, "This guy's a dentist made this. Nobody else would know how to make all these fillings and inserts out of wood and blocks and all that. This guy had to be a dentist, you know." Well, probably was. Next question. How are we doing on time?
We're okay.
Okay.
Well, okay, one of the other things that amazes me is for a lot of these, the number of pulleys that it took to actually make this work. And I have, I know a lot of people have gone into barns where you see, you know, like 3/4 inch metal hooks.
Yeah.
And I'll just comment sometimes on that being a hook for a pulley,
Yeah.
which, you know, a lot of people have just forgotten about. But how many differences were there in pulleys, and how many did it take for a lot of these to operate?
Okay, there's 2 really good questions. How many did it take to make a hay trolley operate? Well, obviously you had the trolley itself, and you had what we call the insert pulley that went into it. Those were generally made out of metal, and so you have all those pulleys, and then you have uh, uh, and many. The answer is many, many, many. We call them line pulleys. So you had to have one pulley in one end of the barn. You know, here's the trolley, so you had to one there to pull it, and then a lot of people had a pulley to take the rope down to grade, and some took it out the back of the barn. Somebody had another pulley and ran it up the front of the barn, so that when you're backing the tractor up and the load's going up, you could see what's going on. And I was well trained in that as a young man. I ran the. My dad was an incredible trainer and used few words. And so he said, "You see this tractor, we're going back there." He said, "You see that 2x4 on the ground?" Yeah. He said, "If you go past that, you'll pull that damn hay trolley right on the end of the barn. And there'll be more to it than that, I tell you, if you do that." So that's clear enough, you know, that's clear enough. But they had this whole series of pulleys. And then to give you an example, of these attendant pulleys that lay around the countryside. So let's see, I'll tell them Margaret found a pulley in a hardware store. She called me, "What is that?" I said, that goes to an Ohio trolley, and it's screwy because it has a bell. Normally the trolley has a bell and the prong goes up in the bell. This one, the trolley had the prong and the bell went up. And I said, "Yeah." She said, "What do you want to do with that?" And I said, "Well, she's working on her museum." I said, "We'll take that over to the hay trolley show, and that'll bring some real money." And so we set that trolley out there, and somebody comes back, "What do you want for that?" $800. Sold. You know, yeah, I grabbed it. "You owe me 800 anyway, so now we're even." So he took it. He turns it around, and I saw there was another guy on the corner of my eye, and he had the trolley. He was over there and grabbed it and said, "Well, that works. That works." So he sold that guy for $1,000. You know. So to answer your question, there's a lot of them, but some of them are worth a lot of money. Yeah, especially the rare ones that go with them, and you'll find those. They usually get attached from the hay fork when they take the fork down, and then somebody takes it loose, and then the pulley goes one way and the trolley goes the other way. Yes, sir.
Can you comment on the different types of forks that were used?
So the question, it's a good one. How many different kinds of hay forks were there? The answer is a lot. They were patented. Jim Moffett was a grain bin salesman down around Springfield. He did all the research for me on trolleys. There's 350 trolleys were patented. And when he did it, he was pretty darn good at it. Hay forks, he did the hay forks. There were 635 hay fork patents. So you take a piece of iron or steel and stick it into a pile of hay, and boy, they did that every way you can think of. I mean, there are some fascinating hay forks, and there's some rare ones, and most of them, the kind with chains that I used growing up for a kid, those are like $3. They don't sell for anything. I thought if anybody drags one more of those down my driveway and tries me to take it, the answer, no, I'm not. You can kill yourself with those things. You pick them up, you get poked in the side, and but there were many, many of them, and many of the old ones from the Civil War era and around there are worth real money. Some will go two, $300, $400, and the super rare ones, we just had a guy sell his stuff out in Pennsylvania, and he had a barn this like 3 times this long, full to the ceiling of stuff and hay forks, and he had some really rare stuff, and it sold for big bucks. So many thousands and thousands. But when you get down to the 8 guys at railroad time that were selling 80% of the stuff, they had about 4 or 5 different designs, and they all sold the same stuff because it worked. It's simple in design and foolproof and operated. So, but originally there are tons of them, and it just fascinates you when you see some of them. Some of them look like an umbrella upside down, and you poked it in the crazy stuff. I doubt that it worked, but a lot is the simple answer. Next question. Yes, sir.
What year was the $15,000 purchase, and what's the most expensive?
Well, you're probably staring at it there. That was a couple of years ago, and I try to get the story out of it. These Amish guys are, you know, there's a lot of Amish pickers and Chupp's Amish that feed that place. Jim and I call it the Amish Mafia. They get together and they find this stuff which is incredible, and then it comes up to national audience. And of course, we literally have people in every state that collect hay trolleys, and so they all know they haven't seen one of those before, and then they get on there and start chattering about it. As they're chattering, the price is going up, 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 and then finally it gets sold. But that's where that one came from. And some of them get a little ornery. And my Amish buddy, the one that cleared out my deal, when I was trying to have a meeting, Rudy, I said, "Do you know that guy?" He's a guy who came on. "Yeah, I know that guy." He said, "I haven't very good luck with him. He's a little." I said, "Well, I've decided to buy him a Christmas present." And Rudy, my Amish friend, says, "What's that?" I said, "I think I'm going to buy him a Bible." And Rudy burst out laughing. He said, "That's perfect." The Amish do have quite a sense of humor. He said, "Well, the guy could use a Bible. He's a little bit ornery." Yes, sir.
How much do you do to restore these? These are nicely painted.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
were they originally that finished? And do you recast parts, or how much restoration do you do?
The question is about restoration, which is a great question. Yes to all of the above, to everything you said. I decided early on, and we celebrate these any way anybody wants to do them. But I had a friend, early friend, when I started collecting. His wife did hog oilers. If any of you know what a hog oiler is, she did hog oilers and he did hay carriers. And she said, "Steve, let me put it this way." She said, "If you want women and children to look at these things, I highly suggest you clean them up and paint them and letter them so they can read them." And that stuck with me. I thought, yeah, that's right. And I do want children to be interested in these things. And we just got back from Carl's, and he did his museum. He keeps everything original, whatever, he brushes them. We have guys that do everything to them that you could think of, from sandblasting them. Jim takes his apart and he puts them in a cement mixer with gravel and lets them roll around for 24 hours. And that is the quintessential poor man's way to sandblast a hay trolley, but it works damn good. He gets done, it's pretty damn good. Then we got a new guy. He's the guy that's doing 3 a day. And he calls me up. He said, "Hey, I don't know if I tell you this or not, but he said, it takes a long time to take these things apart. The bolts are all rusty, and I've got enough skinned up knuckles. I sure know that." He said, "Why?" He said, "A lot of guys paint these, and I don't like the paint. I got to get the paint off of me." He said, "So I've got not a torch, but it's a sort of like a flamethrower that you use if you burn prairie or you go out in that. He said, I roll that thing around on the concrete out there. This is a guy that was trying to put them up, and his wife said, no, you're not putting them there. Anyway, he rolls these things around the floor. He said, you know, in about 10 minutes, I let that puppy cool off. And he said, it only takes me 10 minutes to take them apart now. He said, it loosens them up just enough and burns the paint off of them. So we've got people that love doing what I do. We got people that love wire brushing them. They wire brush them, they oil them, they paint them. And people come around to me and say, what do you think? And I said, well, you can do anything you want to. I said, is it going in the house? They said, yeah. And I said, you better sandblast and paint that, or your wife won't have any part of it. And generally that's true. There are some exceptions, but not many. So we celebrate these things. And Carl's museum, he sent pictures of it, and it's about the size of this room. It would blow you away. It is just beautiful what he did, And the way I do them, people come in and my place blows them away because they're saying, so we celebrate doing it any way you want. And every once in a while, we get some wise person on there that start telling people how to do stuff. And we've only had to kick about 4 people off of our Facebook page. but yeah, we can take a lot, but we can't take a lot of that, we're here to have fun. So anybody starts interfering with that, one of these guys, he's been bingoed 4 different times. I mean, we're compassionate. We let him back. He did it again. We let him back. He did it again. But out of here, 3 strikes, you're out. We're not putting up with that. But he's always criticizing people. Yes, we cast parts. If things are busted, like if something were busted on that, you're not going to find it. So a lot of times if you find a super rare trolley like that and one side smashed up and you're lucky enough that both sides are mirror images, then you cast the other side and put it together. That would be the exception. But many of these have many, many parts that are busted, and you can cast them, or you can have a blacksmith try and, reconnoiter them back to what they were. But, every question you ask, the answer is yes. Somebody does that in our group. And then we had an Amish guy, Gideon, and he made a new discovery one year. He was into apple peels, or not potato skins. He said, if you put that in a tank of water with potato skins, that seems to loosen things up a little, sort of makes one heck of a smelly mess, but so Gideon left a batch in the stock tank over the winter, and the next spring he pulled them out, and after the ice had mowed, he said everything was loose, all the wheels loosened up and everything else. So I made a post on that, but it didn't catch on, Most of our guys are not that patient, they want to do it and do it now and enjoy it. So, but yeah, we have people that do all of the above. Jim runs the Pony Express into Canada. We've got casters up in Canada, and people want knockers done. They pulleys. A lot of times the pulleys are chipped or busted that are metal, and we have those cast. So, other questions? Yes, in the back of the room.
Do you have the names on your website, all the different ones, because you mentioned several?
I can't hear you, hon.
With the museums, do you have them listed on your website, since you have mentioned several?
No, we don't. The question was, are any of these museums that we have listed on our website? No, it's a great question. They probably should be, but some of the people like visitors, some of the people don't like visitors. But we're getting to the point now where we have enough of them. We probably ought to do that. That's probably a good idea. How many of you got Farm Collector magazine over the years? Yeah, a few, not many. And one of the couples that came to see me, this is really a quick story. He called me up. He's from New York. He says, I and my wife get Farm Collector magazine. So we discovered you hay trolley guys, and we want to come out, and we're going all the way to California, and we're coming all the way back. And we're going to stop at Old Threshers and Mount Pleasant. That's one of the biggest steam shows in the world. And we want to stop for a visit. That'll be fine. So they stop in on the front end of the thing. We show them the pavilion and everything. And I ended up buying a bunch of trolleys from him. Fultonville, New York, it had a funky looking trolley. But at any rate, they come through, and I have a little guest house. Looks like a German hunting lodge. It's pretty cool inside. And I showed them the trolleys, and I showed them that. And they said, "Well, we're set down. We're set up down there, and we got a tent down there, and we're going to camp down there at Old Threshers. So that's good." And it was about like today, it's hot and so forth. And I didn't realize that these two Yukon grads, traveled with a tent and, a couple of cots. And so I walked his wife into the bedroom. I said, you could stay down there at Mount Pleasant, or if you want, you can use the guest house. And she turns to her husband. He said, "Well, we already set the tent up." She said, "You're going to go sleep in the tent. I'm sleeping here tonight." First time on the whole trip, she got to sleep in a bed, Oh, God. Yes. Okay, final question. Who's going to do it? Yes, sir.
Is there a link between like a hay fork and the hay trolley as far as they're done? For example, you buy a hay trolley, they come in, are there some came in a set, kind of like a car?
Yeah. Great question. Were the hay trolley and the hay fork paired up? And I'd say after 1900, the answer is probably most of the time, because by then they were in the catalogs, and each manufacturer, whether it was Porter or Loudon or whoever it was, Goshen, they would offer hay forks in their catalog. So when they got it, it wouldn't necessarily be a Goshen or a Myers hay fork, but they all sold the same stuff because the hay fork guys had also consolidated. And it's funny, one of the biggest sellers of hay forks at the end was from Valparaiso, Indiana. They sold a ton of them. That was the one with the 4 forks and the chains that were hooked on them. So the answer is, once the railroads came in and it was the turn of the century and stuff were sold in catalogs, they were pretty much paired. But before that, Johnny bar the door, it could have been anybody's hay fork and anybody's trolley that were hooked together.
So does that increase the value, or do you find more many that are in sets, or are they pretty much all separated by now?
They're pretty much all separated by now. And
Tell if they were ever originally together, kind of like a car with a.
no, only if you find them in the barn, they got paint on them. Then you pretty much know, yeah, those were made at the same time. Probably came out of the same catalog. And although the manufacturers weren't the same, they were paired together from the get-go. All righty.
Let's give Steve a big hand.
Thank you.
Well, really what he was talking about was technology at the time that was really a major impact on agriculture over about a 50, 60-year period there, from basically the end of the Civil War up into when hay started being baled, whether it was round or square with a stationary baler. That really started to begin to change things for hay trolleys. But if you think about, especially, you can look at some of the picture Mac has over there, hay hoods. There was no reason to have a hay hood unless you had a hay trolley. So, that was one big change. Anyway, then you also, if you think of just the typical English style barn that, you can see back and most of them you've seen, those maybe after hay trolleys, maybe before, most of them might have wood floors, the very old ones, before hay trolleys. They'd have lofts, certainly after hay trolleys, but you'd have to unload in the aisle. Then once you had a hay hood, you could have a loft over the entire barn at that point. And, there's just a lot of innovation that came about that had to do with the hay trolley. So I think it's just valuable for us to think about how some of that worked out in agricultural history and the way that technology of the day changed things. Okay, we've got another little break built in here. So we'll give you a chance to go to the restroom, grab something else. We'll come back and we'll handle the annual meeting portion of this meeting, which is of course what it's for. And, really you're supposed to, as an organization, have an annual meeting each year. So we'll do that, and then we'll all eat here anyway, which I'm looking forward to certainly. So thanks again, Steve. Appreciate you and everybody who came.